Okay, I think we can start. Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Open Data in the COVID-19 Pandemic. My name is Melissa, I'm a marketing executive at F1000 and I will be here to provide any technical support in today's session. So before we start, I will cover some basic webinar housekeeping. First of all participants will be muted throughout the webinar, but please do write your questions in the questions box, which can be found on your GoToWebinar control panel, which looks like the image on this slide. Our presenter will be answering as many questions as possible during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. However, if your question isn't answered today, we'll be in touch with you shortly after. Also, if you need to drop off the webinar for any reason, the session is being recorded and will be sent to you a couple of days after the webinar. I will now pass over to James Parker, Associate Publisher at F1000, who will walk you through open data in the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you everyone for joining. So yeah, as was said, I'm James. I'm an Associate Publisher at F1000. I work on a number of our infectious disease content across F1000 research, hence why we're giving this webinar today. And I also previously used to work on our in-house editors, and part of that role would have included performing the data checks that we perform on any submissions that come in. So with that in mind, towards the end, if you have any questions about, in general, about the presentation, but additionally about F1000, the publishing model and how submissions work, then feel free to add them to the questions panel, and I will get around to them there. In terms of what we're covering today, first of all, we'll be looking at open data, just sort of looking at how we define it, what it is. Next, we'll be looking at open data in the context of the pandemic and some of the changes that occurred there. And then finally, we'll be looking at open data and how we at F1000 work on that. So let's get started. We'll be looking at open data. So I guess one of the questions you always ask is, what is data? This is definitely a question that some of our authors have when it comes to us asking about what data they should be provided. There are many ways you can go about defining it, and it can get, I guess, in some ways confusing. I mean, across here we have 5 separate different definitions of varying different levels of detail. So we start at this one in the top left. This is quite a sort of specific one, referring to data as relational category. It's applied to research outputs that are taken at specific moments of inquiry. Or you could move to this one, a bit more sort of general information collected using specific methods for a specific purpose. This one down here, add the context of it having to be something that's going to be published in a peer-reviewed journal. Or on this one, this is almost more of a dictionary definition, data being a set of qualitative or quantitative variables about one or more persons or objects. And then finally down this one, this is more of a higher level one, a sort of all-encompassing sort of definition, the recorded information necessary to support or validate a research project's observations, findings or outputs, or which is required for legal, funder or regulatory compliance. So lots of different ways of going about defining what data is. At F1000, we are a bit more simplistic. So in terms of how we define data, we consider data to be sort of anything that is produced for or by a given project, or that you might use within your project, which is obviously quite high level, quite all-encompassing. So the way we go about this is then to break it down into further categories, and these are into 4 broad categories: source data, underlying data, extended data, and code. And in terms of what these mean, source data is where we're referring classically to third-party data, data that has been produced by others that you might use for the purpose of your study. So a classic example of this in sort of life and health sciences would be something like the demographic health survey, sort of a large data set collected by others that many people will then gain access to and analyze, looking at specific topics or for the purposes of specific analyses. Then you have underlying data. So this is data produced for the purposes of the reported study. So in general, this is your own data, and this is the type of data that we'd be expecting our authors to provide and upload to a structured repository alongside their submissions. Then we move to extended data. So these are materials produced for the purposes of the reported study. So if you were to go to other journals, this would probably be what you'd consider to be things like supplementary materials. So we're talking about reporting guidelines and questionnaires, things like that. The reason why we define them as data is if you were to go to the majority of these journals, you'd find that they are classically published on the article site, usually in PDF or a Word doc format, which means they're not particularly fair. So by treating them like data, in this case extended data, and upload them to a structured repository, assigning them a DOI and a license, we can ensure that all the materials alongside a given article are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And then finally, we have code. So code really could be its own distinct category here, but in a similar way to extended data, we like to treat this using those fair data principles. So for this, it's code produced either as the primary output of your study. So examples of that would be things like our software tool articles, where an author is reporting specifically on a piece of software or an algorithm that they produced to perform a certain function. Or additionally, this might refer to code for the purposes of replication. So this will classically be code you might use to conduct statistical analysis, where authors will provide this so that others can then replicate their statistical analysis exactly. And again, use classing them under this data so that we can ensure that that code, is stored in a way that people can access it and reuse it as well. And when we talk about data, because of our open data policy, we are talking about open data. So the distinction there being that open data is data that's available to everyone to access, use, and share. So classically, data uploaded to a structured repository where it's assigned an open license, classically either CC0 or CC BY license. In terms of the benefits of open data, so open data is a key pillar of open research, along with things like open access, open lab books, etc. It massively aids in reproducibility, having the data underlying results provided alongside the methodology and results being reported. It aids in also the transparency of reporting. There are also practical benefits to sharing your data. There was a particular study that was conducted, that was published in 2020, that was published in PLOS, and that found that authors who underwent open data practices could expect to see up to 25% increase in citations for their articles. It also facilitates the reuse of data, and in later slides we can see why this was important over the pandemic. Additionally, it also helps to ensure that data scientists that classically might not have been included in the authorship of a given article, but can certainly be included in the author list of a data set, ensuring they're getting the credit that they deserve. And then finally, what it's really valuable for, and this has definitely been important in the context of the pandemic, is it increases public trust in science and the results being reported. And this is something we're going to explore on this next slide. So to round off our discussion about open data and why it's important, I thought it would be good to select out a particular case study. And in this case, we're going to be looking at a series of papers that were published early on in the pandemic, around May time in 2020, that all emerged from data sets being provided by a company called Surgisphere. So Surgisphere provided hospital data to a number of studies, wide-ranging data on different drugs being used in different hospitals in the treatment of COVID-19. In particular, it was 3 studies that gained notoriety at this point. So there was one that was published in The Lancet. This focused on hydrochloroquine and chloroquine, which was an anti-malarial drug that at the start, particularly at the start of the pandemic, got a lot of press as being a potential drug that might work in terms of treating COVID-19. And if you remember, it gained quite a lot of traction in the US, as well as the president at the time, Donald Trump, was suggesting that this should be incorporated into treatment plans. And the article itself, what it did is it concluded that based off the data provided by Surgisphere, that coronavirus patients taking chloroquine or hydrochloroquine were more likely to show irregular heart rhythms. This was a known side effect of the drug, but was considered quite rare, and it also indicated that they were more likely to die in hospital. The second article that then focused on a number of cardiac drugs, particularly focusing on angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors. There was a belief that some of these drugs, in patients taking these drugs, they might have been at higher risk of mortality from COVID-19. However, this particular paper concluded that there didn't appear to be any increased risk of death. And then finally, there was a preprint that was published on a preprint server that focused on ivermectin, the anti-Helminth drug that again sort of gained a lot of traction as a potential treatment of COVID. And additionally, in this case, it was also considered to be a potential prophylactic drug to prevent infection. And in this case, the preprint reported that ivermectin dramatically reduced the mortality in COVID-19 patients. So a series of papers that were released, and they gained a lot of traction, a lot of press, and this actually had some serious real-world impacts. So in the case of ivermectin, a drug that's widely used in places like South America, a number of South American health agencies actually decided to then incorporate ivermectin into their treatment plans. Similarly, with hydrochloroquine, there was a WHO clinical trial that ended up being paused as a result of the reports from these particular articles. However, as sort of time went on and more people were reading these articles, a number of concerns were raised, and this led to an expression of concern being published across both of the papers on the Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine. The concerns were on three main points. Number one, the size of the data sets. It wasn't believed that they could have this many patients included in this short amount of time, considering this was in May 2020. Additionally, the doses used were called into question, and additionally, the demographics of the patient population that was included within these data sets. So following these concerns, the journals then went back to the authors and had a discussion, and it was decided that they would go through a data audit. When it got to the point of auditing the data, the company then said that they were unable to supply that data due to confidentiality reasons. So given that, the fact that they were unable to verify the underlying data, the journals took the step to then retract these papers. And additionally, that preprint on ivermectin was also removed from the preprint server it was hosted on. The treatment, and then particularly with things like the WHO clinical trial, that was then restarted following this. So the question is sort of, would open data have made a difference here? So it's hard to say when it comes to the editorial process of these given journals. You'd hope that with the data available there, editors and peer reviewers have been able to look through these data sets and be able to scrutinize the difference between the results being reported and the underlying data. But what I think you could certainly say is that given that the response to these articles was community driven, I would say that if this data was openly available alongside this article, with the community able to scrutinize it and look at it, I imagine that we would have come to the conclusion that there was problems with the reported results far quicker than we would have done otherwise, and it may have averted some of the sort of real world changes that we saw due to these articles, in the sense of pausing clinical trials and also changing health policies. So an example here during COVID of where data was not made available where potentially it should have been. So moving on to looking at open data and the pandemic more generally. So of course, with the pandemic, it led to significant disruption, and this led to a lot of change in views in terms of reuse. So of course, with across the world, a number of countries ended up going into lockdowns. This caused significant disruption to people being able to perform their work, and this also applied to researchers, particularly them not being able to get into the lab and conduct all the experiments that they would have wanted to perform. Science, of course, is a very collaborative discipline, and collaboration is something that certainly would have suffered during these lockdowns over the course of the pandemic. And the effects of this were actually captured within a report from Digital Science, the State of Open Data 2020 report. They surveyed authors across the world on the impact of the pandemic on their research and research practices, and it found that 10% indicated they only 10% indicate they could maintain all of their work commitments, and 30% indicated they were 32% indicated they were either extremely or very impacted by the pandemic. So extremely in this case indicating that they either were unable to perform any of their sort of standard research practices, or very indicating very few of them. And in response to this, what we saw was a sort of fueled an increase in the intentions of researchers to reuse either their own data or the data of others. So we can see this highlighted in this graph here. where from the authors surveyed, we could see that 58% had used their own data before or reused other people's data, was 44%. But when we looked at likely to use either their own or other people's data in the state of lockdown, this was increased to 64% and 50% respectively. And again, likely to use over the next 12 to 18 months, 65% and 51% respectively. So you can see here scientific community adapting to the fact that they were unable to potentially collect all the data they would classically have been able to do, and instead focusing on reusing available data, whether it be their own or others. Additionally, what we saw was a very much change in the way that people went about publishing their work as well. And you could definitely see that while the world closed due to these lockdowns, science opened. Pandemic drove a huge increase in open science practices, and this was probably most significantly highlighted in the use of preprints. So in that first year, in 2020, more than 30,000 preprints were published, and many of these, particularly in the early stages, reported really key discoveries that influenced health policies. So this included things like early transmission data that then fed into government policies around things like isolation periods. So really important data, particularly at that very early stage where we knew very little. The rapid dissemination of that information was really beneficial. And additionally, most publishers also underwent a commitment to ensure that any articles being published on COVID-19 were made openly or freely available to use. And this particular report on the response of scholarly communication system to the COVID-19 pandemic from the Research on Research Institute found that 88% of COVID-19 articles were made openly or freely available. In terms of data, we also saw a sort of the flagship example of open data benefiting our response to the pandemic in the early sharing of the SARS-CoV-2 genome back in January 2020. And given the sort of rapid turnaround of the things like the mRNA vaccine, which obviously would have relied heavily on this being shared early, we can really see the benefits of that early and rapid sharing of data. And we can also see that continuing to occur throughout the pandemic. So a really great example of this would be the Sanger Institute. They are constantly surveying different variants across the UK through regular testing, and they then upload all that genetic data onto their website for anyone then to access and use. So not only examples of open sharing at the very beginning, but also we can see that continuing throughout. Additionally, from that same survey, they found that respondents indicated that 47% of them had made their COVID-19 data openly available when they published their articles. Additionally, we could see that there's still more work to be done. So while we did see a huge increase in the use of preprints, at least initially, only 4 to 6% overall of the articles published had a corresponding preprint. So there's still that still some change needed there in terms of focusing on that rapid dissemination, with the majority of authors still choosing to submit directly to peer-reviewed journals. And additionally, when digging into the sort of data practices, we also found that from a particular study from Lucas Dominguez et al., they surveyed a load of articles between January to April 2020. And of the almost 6,000 that they surveyed, only 800 made their data openly available. And when you dug down into that 800, it was then found that only 1.2% were shared in a format that allowed reuse. And to be more specific about what that meant, it was where they were sharing data either as a PDF or Word document that contained textual or graphic materials, so therefore wasn't particularly interoperable or machine readable. And on that similar topic, a further study from Maxwell et al. Found that data sharing was also concentrated in high-income countries. And additionally, when looking at sort of the fairness of the data, it was also found that clinical data was far less fair than molecular data. So while we did see some strides in terms of open data and open science practices in general, we can clearly see that there is still more work to be done, particularly in the field of open data. So moving on from that, we're going to look at open data and F1000 and how we go about it. So in terms of our sort of journey with data from our inception, F1000 Research, our own platform, our publishing platform, was launched back in 2013. And almost immediately, we started to consider open data as something that we want to integrate. So we then piloted a policy of mandatory data sharing, and this was then successful, and we chose to then introduce it. So almost from the inception of F1000 research, we have had a mandatory data sharing policy. In 2014, so the year after, we then endorsed the FORS 11 data citation principles, these being considered sort of an early precursor to the now sort of industry standard FAIR data principles. In 2015, we then turned our attention to code, making a mandatory code sharing policy, particularly focusing in on things like software tools, where the main output of the study would have been their code, so treating that in the same way that we would have treated data. And then a bit more recently, in 2018, we introduced our FAIR data guidelines, so overhauled our previous guidelines to ensure that they were in compliance with the FAIR data principles. So in terms of digging into what our data policies exactly are, so all articles on F1000 that report original results should include the source data underlying the results, together with details of any software used to process the results. And then additionally, failure to provide the source data for publication without justification is likely to result in the article being rejected. So as we have that mandatory data sharing policy, sharing your data is a barrier to entry. So authors who do not share their data on submission without meeting one of our exceptions, and I'll go through those in a bit more detail on the next slide, they would be asked for a reason why they were unable to share it, and if it didn't meet our principles, their article would then be rejected. We always provide our authors with options to resubmit, and we'll provide guidance on the data that we expect to see, and guidance on how they could go about preparing their data and finding a appropriate repository. But it is a requirement for submissions to F1000. Additionally, when we talk about open data and data in general, given our sort of change in our policies, we are really talking about FAIR data, so ensuring that our data is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And these FAIR data principles, I think, are best reflected in our data availability statements that we include on all of our articles. So I'll be going through some of these here. So these are a really great demonstration of FAIR data in practice. So here we have two examples of data availability statements from two separate articles. So in this case, we have an article that has some source data, some underlying data, extended data, and then reporting guidelines. So reporting guidelines wasn't a category I mentioned before. This is effectively a form of extended data, but to ensure that it's easier for readers and reviewers to identify and find these checklists when they are required, as it really helps with aiding the reproducibility and transparency of reporting, we like to give them their own statement, just only sections, sorry, so people can access them and find them a bit easier. In this case, we have underlying data included here with some extended data, and additionally, in this case, a software availability statement. So the software availability statement is where we'll house details of any code that is included in a given study. So in terms of going through these in a bit of detail, so when we look at source data here, this is an example of third-party data. So this is also an example of one of our exceptions for sharing data. So where data belongs to a third party, we would not expect our authors to then take that data and upload it to a repository under their own name and under an open license, as they do not own it. So instead, what we require is that the authors provide details of how others can access the data in the same way they have, and we can see that done here. So in this case, it's two data sets from the demographic health surveys, which are available from their website. So they provided specific links out to the exact documents they've used. And again, here with this other data set, they provided a link again to where they have accessed that data set. Moving to underlying data. So here we have an example where data has been restricted for ethical or confidentiality reasons. Again, this is another example of one of our exceptions. So we of course understand that in some cases it might be you might be unable to fully de-identify a data set, or potentially the terms of your consent forms or ethical approval may not allow for the sharing of your data openly. In those cases, what we require is that the authors provide a description of the restrictions on the data, and the reasons for those restrictions, how people can apply for access, and under which conditions that access will be granted. So we can see that included here. So the authors indicate that the data access is restricted to use with appropriate ethical approval from the committees listed in the ethical consideration section. Reasons for use may apply to the authors for access by providing a written description, background, reasons, and intended use. And then if the methodology does not violate the conditions of the informed consent under which the interviews were conducted, the proposal was approved by their ethics board, the users can obtain the data from the corresponding author and include one of the authors in the project and analysis. So there we have description of the restrictions, a description of how people can apply for access, and then the conditions under which that access will be granted. Moving then into the extended data. So this is the first example of how we classically will structure our data availability statements where there's data to be shared. So the way we do this is by first mentioning the repository itself, in this case Dryad. Then we'll have the title of the dataset, the DOI, and then additionally here you can see also we have a citation. So one of the last steps that our editors will perform before sending one of our articles through to production is that they will go to the dataset, take the citation and add it to the references of the article, and then they will then go through the article and cite that data set wherever it is mentioned throughout the text, including in the data availability statement, ensuring that the data set and article are reciprocally cited and therefore reciprocally linked. And then after that, we have a description of the files that are included. In this particular case, the authors also included these files on an institutional repository as well as a general repository. So they indicated the file included and then additionally a link to where that can also be found on their institutional page. And then we have a similar format for reporting guidelines, but in this case we add a description of the particular checklist that's been included, in this case the STARI checklist. And finally at the bottom then we have a description of the license under which the data is housed. So in this case we can see it's a Creative Commons CC0 license. So as we have an open data policy, the CC0 license and the CC BY license are the only two licenses that we accept, as they allow for unrestricted reuse of the data that you share. There are some exceptions for equivalent licenses. So a good example here in the UK would be something like the Open Government license, where it's effectively a copy of something like the Creative Commons license, allowing reuse under similar terms. But in general, when we're talking about open data, we are open data licenses. These are the only two that we in general accept. Moving on to this example, we can see that same structure of the data availability statement, particularly when referring to the data itself. But in this case, the authors have chosen to create a individual data deposit for each of their individual data files, but following that same format. So repository, in this case, Zenodo, title, DOI, citation. Again, with the extended data, in this case, they've chosen to then use that similar structure to here. So the single data set and then listing each of the files with a description of it below. And then we can see there the license included here. And then for software availability, so we will require an archive version of the software, but we also encourage authors to use a versioning system to include new versions of their code as it might be developed over time. So here we can see that included here. So we have a link out to the versioning system, and most commonly used one here being GitHub. And then after that, we have the source code that has been archived, and that's done with Zenodo. Particularly with GitHub, it's very easy to do that, as you can archive directly from GitHub to Zenodo. And in this case, again, including the license, but in this case, we're talking about open software licenses. So in this case, the authors have used the GN General Public license. So in terms of demonstrating the fair data principles, we can see that achieved through various different aspects of these data availability statements. So here we can see that we have the DOI and the reference, that making this data findable and also accessible to any of the readers. Then we look at interoperability. So an example can be highlighted here where the authors have included their data in a CSV file. That meaning that that data file can be read by pretty much any software that can handle spreadsheets, allowing it to be interoperable and used across software. And then in terms of reusability, this is best highlighted using the licenses as they allow unrestricted reuse of the data, the only exception being with the CC BY license where you're expected to cite the authors when using the data. So a demonstration of how we format our data availability statements, but also demonstrating where those fair data principles are in practice across our publications. In terms of getting your data to a point of sharing it, there are obviously a number of steps. So we put together this sort of infographic for how we suggest you go about this. So, and we call this our 4 steps to open research data. So in terms of the first step, you're talking about preparing your data for sharing. So this can mean different things depending on the data set that you are using. For something that maybe is more laboratory based, this could be just ensuring that you have the correct data types. At F1000, we like to go quite granular with the data that we have that we get our authors to provide. So an example there would be something like a quantitative PCR, where other journals might be happy with, say, just your delta CTs. We want the actual raw CT files from there. Additionally, with things like Western blots and images, we want the raw uncropped images to be provided and uploaded to repositories. And then taking a more sort of clinical look at it, this would be going through your data, ensuring it's been sufficiently identified using certain data de-identifying principles, things like the safe harbor method and other things like that. Once you've prepared your data, you have your files ready, then you can progress to selecting a repository. Selecting a repository can be sort of more general, so you could be thinking, oh, I've just got a sort of multidisciplinary sort of study going on, I've got lots of different data files, it's not specific in any way. Then something like Figshare, Harvard Dataverse, OSF would likely be appropriate there. But in other cases, and a classic example of this would be something like genetic data, where there are sort of discipline-specific repositories, things like GenBank, then you may be looking to submit there instead. But of course, that is down to you. We do provide guidance on our website as well for helping you to identify particular repositories, and also have a list of our approved repositories there as well to aid authors. But once you've got to that point, you've selected your repository, then you can go and upload your data. And uploading your data is vital for the next step, as the next step is writing your data availability statement. And to be able to write that, we need to have, as demonstrated on the previous slide, the DOI and license. And that will only, you need to take that from the repository deposit itself. And then using that information, you can go through and draft that data availability statement. So indicate the repository, add the title, add the DOI, and then list out all the data files that are included in that deposit. And then once that's ready, that can then proceed to publication. And following publication, we then recommend that our authors then go back and link your data to the article. So we will cite your data set throughout the article, as demonstrated on the previous slide. But then we encourage our authors to then go back and add the citation of the article itself to the repository page, so that aids in ensuring that reciprocal link is there. And anyone then who goes from might find one or the other can then be linked back to the relevant either data set or article. So those 4 steps to ensure that your data is fully open and available for anyone to find and also to reuse. So next, I wanted to go through some examples of open data practices in F1000 in the context of COVID-19. So first of all, highlighting this article from Petrulio et al., which is the one-stop shop collection of publicly available information on COVID-19 in vitro diagnostic medical devices. So this is a data note. Data notes are small article types that provide the rationale and methods for producing a particular data set. They don't include any methodology. They might include a small bit of validation, not methodology, results, sorry, a small bit of validation, but it only really includes the reasons for collecting the data set and how that data set was collected. And what these aid with is, number one, it means that anyone who accesses your data set could then be linked back and understand the methods used to produce that particular data set. And then additionally, what will also be helpful here is it really helps to increase the discoverability of your data. So people are classically going to be looking for information about their given subjects in places where articles are held, not necessarily in repositories where data is held. So by creating this sort of bibliometric flag for your data set in places like PubMed and Scopus, where people are much more likely to be trying to find information about a given subject, that will aid in increasing the discoverability of your data set as both of them are reciprocally linked. So looking at this particular data note in this case, so it was reporting on COVID-19 in vitro diagnostic devices and test methods. So what it did is it brought together all publicly information on the performance of CE marked in vitro diagnostic medical devices, as well as in-house laboratory developed devices and related test methods. So what this is a really great example of openly available information being used to create an open data set. So creating a single place, and so instead of loads of people having to go away and search for all this data and try and find it themselves, we can avoid that sort of duplication of effort as this one group have gone away, collated all of that information into one single place that is then available for everyone. And at the bottom here, we have a quote from the authors themselves, which I think is really nice, saying it is open, fully transparent, and freely available to everyone, to researchers, practitioners, member state, national authorities, local healthcare authorities, hospital doctors, family doctors, students, and citizens. And that reflects a really key aspect of open data and open science in general. It is not specific to researchers, it is information that is available to everyone. And of course, there are some sort of arguments that says that, particularly this being a good example, where it's a study that was funded by the European Union, where science and these studies are funded by taxpayer money or from charities, there is an argument that you could say that there is a responsibility to then share that data, as that data sort of belongs to everyone. But this is an example of that open data practices creating a useful resource that anyone can access. On this next slide, we're looking at an article from our Wellcome Open Research platform. So that is a platform that has been set up by the Wellcome Trust in the UK using the F1000 model, but it's specific to Wellcome funded authors. In this case, the article we're looking at is a living mapping review for COVID-19 funded research projects. So this is an article that was published by the UK Collaborative on Development Research and the Global Research Collaboration for Infectious Disease Preparedness. And what they've been doing is working to develop a live database of funded research projects across the world related to COVID-19. And in addition to that, they then published this living mapping review alongside it. So a living mapping review is a variation of a living systematic review, a systematic review that is, constantly is surveying the available literature and then updating the article as and when new evidence becomes available, and this being facilitated in this case through F1000's versioning system, meaning that the authors can come back and publish a new version that's reciprocally linked through the same DOI instead of having to go away and publish an entirely new article. In this case, it's referred to as a living mapping review, so because instead of the subject matter being published articles, it's instead looking at grants. So through this living mapping review, they were able to provide a descriptive and thematic analysis of the data set as they're collecting it. And then additionally, using that living method, they can provide the snapshots, in this case, every 3 months on how that landscape is changing. Again, we have a quote here from the authors. So the research funding response has started to plateau. This living mapping review is even more important to direct remaining research funds and activities to areas of continued needs and to prevent duplication with ongoing studies. So obviously loads and loads of funding going into COVID-19 across loads of different subjects and for loads of different purposes. Not all funders are going to be constantly communicating with each other or know where others are funding certain areas, and that could obviously lead to the risk of duplication of effort. And again, this is something that is a benefit of open science and particularly open data sharing in general, is preventing that duplication of effort, particularly when it comes to things like null results as well, classically things that would not go published, where people might end up performing the exact same studies or the exact same analyses and coming to the same conclusion. By openly sharing that along with the data, you can really help to avoid that duplication of effort. And in the context of this, that can be really valuable, particularly to think about smaller funders where they might have a smaller portfolio available to fund. they can directly map where they think the research gaps are, immediately access this data set and use it to decide where they want to push their funding, particularly as the author said here that with that research funding starting to plateau, we're probably going to have to be more directed with how we go about funding research into COVID-19 in the future. So where are we now? So we can see from the previous examples that the pandemic has led to a significant increase in open science practices. That was reflected both in use of preprints and things like reuse of data, and additionally with data sharing, but we can also see that there's more work to be done. We could see through the lockdowns that move towards reuse of data, and that highlighting one of the key benefits of open science. And we also saw with things like the SARS-CoV-2 genome being shared, but additionally with the Searchsphere incident, that we have examples of where open data worked, but additionally where it is probably needed as well. So there's still more work to be done on open data, and this isn't just the responsibility of the researchers who own the data, it's the responsibility of publishers to encourage this and to provide guidance on how researchers can go about this. And I hope that through demonstrating the work that we do on data availability statements, etc., you can see how F1000 goes about this. But it's also the responsibility of funders to incentivize and mandate data sharing. This is something that is done by some funders, but could certainly be done much better by others. And this will hopefully foster open data practices going forward, with the clear benefits of this being demonstrated over the course of the pandemic. So a great way of demonstrating what can be done, and it's now for us all together to sort of work together to ensure that we're progressing these practices going forward. So before we wrap up, and this will be something that you'll be able to access in the handout, but this is just some further reading, so highlighting some useful resources across F1000. So we have a number of landing pages around open data. We also have an open data toolkit, which has a number of really useful resources about drafting data availability statements, selecting repositories, etc. And then also we have some links out here to our various gateways housing content around COVID-19. So the Emerging Disease and Outbreaks Gateway is a gateway that houses pretty much all of our COVID-19 content. But additionally, we have a number of other gateways and collections. In particular, we have one that will be launching later this week, the Pathogens Gateway, but information about all of those gateways and collections on infectious disease can be found through that link. And then finally, if you wanted to have a look at some of the content on Wellcome, in particular, similar to that article that we highlighted before, that living mapping review, that's a link there to the COVID-19 collection on Wellcome Open Research. But that is everything for me. So thank you all for listening. And yeah, we can move to answering any questions that may have come up.